Thank you all for coming along this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and it's a great pleasure to have Ian Chubb, the Chief Scientist of Australia here. For the first time since August last year, when I went to New Zealand and was exposed to the greatest collection of chief scientists in the world, I've actually got a few more chief scientists in the room with me today, and we've had the Forum of Chief Scientists of Australia meeting in this building, and it's been a great pleasure to have everyone here. But at that particular meeting in New Zealand, I was really impressed by the New Zealanders all getting up and saying a few words in Maori as a form of acknowledgement of the first people of their land. And since I've come back from that meeting, I've taken that up as something that I wanted to do. So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of listening to me in Noongar, let me try a few words of welcome to you all. So, kai morich bridi maman, kai morich bridi yoga, kai nunakot. Nun jarapan nija yai, nija wajak nunga buja, nunga kardak nija buja kalikul. Yunga kurungkul karjin yunga morich babin Jason Barrow. So what I've tried to say is wanju wanju, which is welcome everyone here today, and we're really pleased to have you here. I welcomed the big boss man, because there isn't an equivalent of chief scientist that I could discover in my limited knowledge of Noongar. I welcomed all the big boss women, and I welcomed everyone else here. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I said that we are on the land of the Noongar people, particularly the Wajak people, who inhabited this area that we call the Swan River, and they call the Derbil Yarragon. And the Noongar people, I said, will be the custodians of this land always. And I thanked my coaches from Kurungkul Karajin, which is a centre at the university, at Edith County University. And I thanked my own personal coach, Jason Barrow. So, having said that and welcomed you to and acknowledged the traditional owners of the land, it's now my great pleasure, it is a genuine pleasure to have Ian Chubb, the Australian Chief Scientist here. Ian has a long and terrific history in science. He's been the Chief Scientist of Australia for the last 5 years. He was the Vice-Chancellor at ANU for a decade. Before that, the Vice-Chancellor at Flinders University. A long and distinguished career, and I think it is just wonderful that we have this opportunity to hear Ian's story about STEM. He's been working incredibly hard to try and make STEM a serious topic on the agenda politically, and we are starting to get some traction, and that's going to be the basis of Ian's talk today. So over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be here on this side of the continent and to talk about what is one of my favourite subjects, and that is science. And I'll fall into a trap tonight, and I'll say science when in fact what I mean is what I will mean always is science, technology, engineering and mathematics. So for the engineers in the audience, the mathematicians in the audience, the technologists in the audience, too bad. But I love you all, and so please remember that when I say science, that I will almost certainly mean STEM. And part of my role for the last now 4.5 years or so has been to try to get a rethinking of how we go about science in this country. When I was a Vice-Chancellor and you're focused on your institution and you're focused on all the people who populate your institution and the students, and I don't know whether any of you have ever had to worry about and take care of 14,000 kids of other people, not all of whom are as well brought up as your own kids, it does provide quite a focus and a focus of your attention and your working day. But when I took this job, I remember getting rung by the then Prime Minister, and all I can tell you is it was one of three in the 4.5 years since I've been in the job. And and he, so that limits it to one of two. And it was 4.5 years ago, so that means it was, you can all guess which one it was. And he said to me, "Oh, we'd like you to do this job here." And he said, "And just remember, it's a easy transition into retirement." And that sounded better than a rocking chair and a tot of rum every day. So I said, "Okay, well that sounds good." And anyway, I was interested in doing it, and it's an issue that I've been passionate about, even though for other reasons and the sort of responsibilities I mentioned, you don't always get to pay the attention to it that you would like. And so I took it on, and you immediately, of course, see the world through a different prism or a different facet. And I look at it, and I thought to myself, and I think to myself, and I still think to myself as I learn more every day, how come I didn't see that? And how come when I had the opportunity as the head of two and a deputy head of two other education provider institutions, universities, how come I didn't see it and make some of the changes that I now see to be so evident, so self-evident really? And so a lot of the things that I will talk about today, if any of you feel like asking me when you had the chance, why didn't you do something about it? Don't bother. I don't know the answer, except that I didn't see it in quite the way that I do now. But what that leads me to say is that I've got to prod and nudge and urge differently from the ways that I could once, and that I have to be able to cajole, encourage, get governments to be interested, and to get governments to think about it in a different way from the ways that we have previously done in this country. And the reasons for that, and I'll touch on a bit of it as I go through my talk, but the reasons for that are that we've tended to subdivide things into smaller and smaller parcels. We do it for a whole variety of reasons, almost none of them good, but we do it because it is less embarrassing for the bureaucrat or the politician if a small program goes belly up by contrast with a bigger program going belly up. So when you look at it and you look at a federal government that provides $9.2 billion a year in research and development dollars, when you look at $2 billion of that going into tax incentives for business R&D, and you think to yourself, well, that's all right, that's a nice sort of sum, you can get your head around it, it'd be nice to have it, but you haven't got it, so it's good that they've got it and they're prepared to spend it and invest. What does it mean? Well, what it means is that it's spread over 150 programs and 14 portfolios. And so what happens over here has an impact on something over there. You know, if this department makes some comment and decision about postdoctoral fellowships or PhD scholarships, it will have an impact on our research capacity, our research directions, whatever it might be over here, and you don't necessarily have the coordination that you need to get the maximum benefit from whatever that investment might be. So I've taken the view in this role, and I'll talk about two particular aspects to it. One is that the world is changing. I hate to have to tell you that. The Sydney Swans will win this year's premiership. And I hope that they overcome a 12-goal lead that the West Coast built up and lose by a point. But then I won't come back to Perth for 5 years. But the two things that I want to talk about really are how we sort of conceptualise how we spend research. I'm going to focus on research priorities, but I want to talk first about some of the changes. So 2 years ago, there were some researchers at Oxford who came up with a model that looked at jobs and the jobs that were most at risk from automation. And if you want to go onto that website, then you can find out whether your job is likely to be able to be done by a robot, according to that model, before 20 years are out. Now, I've gone and had a look, and there is no capacity to look at the position of chief scientist, possibly because they're for all time, possibly because they're irreplaceable, or possibly I have to go and look under the big boss rather than chief scientist. But anyway, if you look at other jobs, then they're much less certain, and they're including many jobs that we would have assumed to be both essential and, because of that, to be secure. So according to that model, accountants have a 93% chance of being automated. Some would say that would put a lot of life into accountancy that doesn't always exist, but I could only say that in front of an audience of people interested in science, couldn't I? Anyway, 93% chance of being automated. Bartenders have a 77% chance of being automated. And disappointingly, massage therapists have a 54% chance of being automated. So when you think that that's an elbow in the middle of your back, sort of trying to relax a muscle, it will actually be a stainless steel ball dropped from a height by a robot who will never ask you, does it hurt? But anyway, applying the same model across the Australian economy, a report released last week concluded that 40% of the jobs we do today, which is about 5 million jobs in our economy, will not exist by the year 2030. So that's 5 million will not exist by the year 2030, and that's something to think about. And we have to think about it particularly when we consider that a child starting school this year might be entering TAFE or a university somewhere near 2030, and that he or she will be making subject choices by 2025 at the end of their 10th year of schooling. So if all things stay the same, how will they be influenced, and what sort of choices will they be able to make? What views will inform that choice, and the capabilities that will open or that are exclude the options? And how we do that, all of those issues are being developed in the classroom of today. Remember that I said it's young children who started school this year will be having to make those choices out in 2025 through 2030, and we now are preparing them for that. We're not preparing for that at the 31st of December 2024 or the 31st of December 2029, we are now having to do that. We've got to shape those minds, we've got to support those young minds, we've got to build them in a way that will enable them to make wise choices when they have to make those choices. And I don't think we do that. Of course, there are some good examples of where we do. There are some of those big programs that the large number of programs that I referred to, do that quite well. But when you get it down to the brass ones, what you see is that we are still offering very traditionally the approaches that we take to the development of the skills and talents, the pool of skill and talents that this country will need. And we've got to change. So it's that sort of perspective that I want to bring to the conversation about our nation's future. I want to get, if I can possibly do it, to get you as members of the community to agree with me. But if you don't agree with me, then at least let's take a long view. You're allowed to disagree, and I'm allowed to disagree with you. But we will be successful if each of us, with whatever it is that we're talking about, will take that longer view and think about the fact that today's students going in will be making choices in 2025, and we have to have that in mind when we think about how we're going to teach mathematics or the technologies or science from the very early days, and give them the options to choose when they get to the point of having to make those choices. Open opportunities and not close them off because we were too frightened, thought it was too big a risk to change. We can't afford to do that. And one of the reasons that I want to take and try to encourage everybody to take the longer term view is not only because we've never done it. I mean, when I was talking to the couple of federal ministers a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about a strategy for science, which I'll refer to later. They were saying, oh, you know, it would be good to have this and good to have that. And I said, yes, it would be good. But to have one will actually be good, because we've not, in our history, sat back and said, let's take the long-term view for something that so underpins the future that we've got to be strategic about the approach that we take. And I'll come back to that again in a minute too. So, and one of the reasons why is that I actually do believe in intergenerational equity. I think there is an issue that we have to embrace as one generation hands on the baton to the coming generations. I do think that we have to think seriously about that and what is the state and what is the status and what is the standing of what we do and what we pass on. And I do think that we have to take, and people in my position have to take that very seriously. It would be pretty easy to say, well, let's just go on and continue to do what we've always done because we've always done it and we managed to muddle through. And we can probably do that off into the future too, but I think that's a dereliction of our responsibility. So we've got to be able to find a mechanism, find a way, find a spirit, find a will that will enable us to make some of the changes that we would like to have changed, in order with all the knowledge that we can muster, all the evidence we can find, to say this is a better way. So we do have that obligation to pass on a better world to our children and the coming generations, and we have an obligation to pass on to them the skills that will enable them to do the same for the ones that come after them. So no one has a crystal ball, not researchers at Oxford, not entertainers who call themselves economists when they write for the newspapers, or not even economists who pretend to be omniscient, at least when they write for the newspapers, even if they can't pretend that at home. And I'm not suggesting that massage therapists down tools or that accountants stop counting. But we can't assume that that future is going to look like the present, because the simple fact is that it won't. And we can't assume that all the skills we're going to need will be ready when we need them, unless we start to build them, and do so with care and do so with determination. So we have to look at the patterns of change and reach conclusions in the absence of perfect information. It's what we do as scientists. We take the information that's available, we look at the evidence and we make an interpretation, and all of us know, as experimental scientists, all of us know that that information isn't perfect 99% of the time. But we act on it because we know that if we do more, we will know more, and that we will get better and better and better evidence and information. And we're in the position now where we do have to take some action and build in the absence of perfect information. And we have to try to shape the pattern in the interests of every Australian, with focus, with alignment and with scale. Now, this is not new. Chief scientists have been urging this country to look at the long game for a long time, as have people in similar roles all across the world. There have been successes and there have been disappointments. But what we haven't had until now is a national sense that this work might be important. And we've not had a national commitment to put in the effort required. So I sense that more and more of us though, are opening our eyes today. A lot of people seem to think that we've just found the light, or more likely, that they personally have just brought a great new light to the people. That's what I think. But that's not true. The light's been on for a long time and other countries have seen it. So let me quote from one American president who saw the light some decades ago, and he said, and I quote, "We cannot know where scientific research will lead. The consequences and spin-offs are unknown and unknowable until they happen. But one thing is certain, if we don't explore, others will, and we'll fall behind. This is why I've urged Congress to devote more money to research. It is an indispensable investment in America's future." That president was Ronald Reagan in 1988. But it could easily have been President Obama in 2015 because he said very similar things, or for that matter, President Eisenhower in 1957, who was similarly inclined. The Pope. The Pope is a Catholic, as they say in Australia. The Pope is another leader to see the light. The encyclical he released last week is both a strong statement on the importance of taking action on climate change and a meditation on the place of science in the modern world. So I'm not going to talk about the former, but I will talk about the latter. And he said, and I quote, "Technology has remedied countless evils which used to harm and limit human beings. How can we not feel gratitude and appreciation for this progress, especially in the fields of medicine, engineering and communications? How could we not acknowledge the work of many scientists and engineers who have provided alternatives to make development sustainable? It is right, he went on, to rejoice in these advances and to be excited by the immense possibilities which they continue to open up before us. For science and technology are wonderful products of a God-given human creativity. I hope we all agree with most of that. Some have interpreted the encyclical as a rejection of technological progress, but it isn't. It's a plea for a new compact between science and society in which people are informed and science supports their aspirations. It went on, the encyclical, science and technology are not neutral. From the beginning to the end of a process, various intentions and possibilities are in play and can take on distinct shapes. The fact is that contemporary man has not been trained to use power well, because our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development, or at least a co-development, I might say, in human responsibility, values and conscience. I think I can agree with all of that. Interestingly, it also touches on the political side. Tony Blair, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said something similar to the Royal Society in 2012. And these are words to the effect that science lets us do more, he said, but it doesn't tell us whether doing more is right or wrong. Now, we've got to be in a position to have the conversation in order to reach a good decision. And I put it to you that an informed decision is a good decision. Incidentally, the Pope does have a science qualification. He trained as a lab technician and worked in the food sciences sector. So it is a bit interesting for me that the conclave of cardinals elected a scientist to the pontificate, long before Australians got around to electing a scientist as a Prime Minister. But I hope we don't have to wait for a few centuries before we see that particular light. Anyway, I digress. Of course, we can't expect to prosper from the reflected glow of somebody else's big ideas. We have to see the light for ourselves. So for Australia, I suggest that means adopting a central and unshakable commitment to science. And I mean technology, engineering and mathematics. Answering to our unique needs and building on our own competitive strengths and our own comparative advantages. We need everyone, or as many as possible, to know enough about science to understand how it works and be part of the world where it is often the difference between opportunity and disadvantage. We need enough people with science skills working across the economy, designing cities, improving farms, making products, delivering services. Imagine how good our banking system would be if it was riddled with scientists. I put in parentheses. But we need people who excel in science to be supported in research careers. To excel in science to be supported in research careers with the skills to work in industry or commercialise ideas if they choose to do so. We also need to find a way to fund and coordinate all these things so that people know that when they're being done in their name, at their expense, that they're being done well. Now, people on all sides of politics are making that case, as well as leaders in business, education and the media. So we have a unique moment of opportunity to do something ambitious, and if we get it right, something that will endure. I should let you know that I'm not blind to the magnitude of the task, but I'm optimistic about the strength of our resolve. We're now in a position to be able to do something that I don't think we've been able to do before, and it's up to us to get it done. So this week the government released its consultation paper on a response to my call for a national strategy for Australian science, Australian STEM. Over the coming weeks there will be consultations with different sectors involved across the country, and I'll be there accompanied by, or I will be accompanying to get the order and priority and power right, I will be accompanying the Minister, Ian Macfarlane, and the Parliamentary Secretary, Karen Andrews. The consultation paper's on a website somewhere, and probably if you go onto my website you'll be able to find it. You'll find that it's long, but it's an indication of how many parts of government and the community have to be involved in the science enterprise. It's a whole of government plan to overcome what I referred to earlier, which I could call to the atomisation of our support for science in this country. So it's a whole of government plan because it has to be. And some people call, when we're talking about it, and STEM indeed, they talk about it as a STEM ecosystem. So that if you prod here or you shift there, then the whole system needs to respond. There is no point in fiddling with something there and not expecting or being surprised that it has an impact over here. You have to have an approach that allows you to say the consequences of doing this and that over here will be something we can manage, or at least know, or at least predict. So it has to be a whole of government plan. And if it's going to be a proper plan, and partly for those reasons, it has to be comprehensive and it's got to be ambitious. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to have enough wheels rolling in the same direction and on the right road, and preferably attached to the same vehicle. Now, we rarely achieve that in public policy, in my view, but when it comes to science, we simply have to. And the consequences of, or the need for it, means that we simply have to try and not stop trying. So, like my recommendations in the paper I referred to, the consultation paper is divided into 4 areas: Australian competitiveness, education and training, research and international engagement, because they're all linked, and I don't believe that you can do one without looking and contemplating the other. But we also make the point in my paper that they are means to an end. And what we actually need to understand is, what is the picture on the top of the puzzle box when all of the pieces fit together and work together? And we haven't done that. We don't have that sort of big picture. We haven't had that big picture. So, you know, the economy isn't an end in itself. The economy enables us to do things in the country. So when we hear about the need to have a budget surplus, I can go along with that. But why? In order to get to that position, you have to do things. Governments will have to do things, which in the absence of a whole of government approach to it all, could end up damaging some things that we need to invest in the future, to build the future, whatever it might be. So I, in my head at least, like to distinguish seriously between means and ends, and the end game for me is in Australia, something like I said earlier, much better than it is now across a whole variety of fronts. And all of these pieces, when they fit together, will make it better. So those 4 we've put in this particular paper, because how do you separate them? We can't be a competitive economy if we don't have the science and the research base to produce the ideas that can be turned into something that makes us competitive. And if we don't do it and all the other countries that we compare and contrast ourselves with are, then what is the position for us? Will we be a country, when the Treasurer was talking about the 2.9% growth in GDP and a journalist said to him which of the areas growing, and off the top of his head he nominated 3. Still exporting iron ore, tourism and education. And I thought part of my responsibility is to make sure that the next time the Treasurer is asked about that, he can actually highlight some areas where we make something that the world markets want, and we can send it out there and use that to help boost and sustain our economy. I don't blame him for saying what he said. That's the truth. But is that our future? That's what we do. Make sure we bring them in by the plane load and spend money and go home again and say that's great. Of course it's always going to be an important part of the economy, but surely that can't be all of it. Or international education. Of course it's an important part of our activity. It's important for our universities that we bring in people from overseas and mix with our students and learn things from each other, not just mathematics or chemistry, but from each other, cultures, languages, whatever. But is that all? Hope not. So we are going out and consulting on that plan, as I said, and the aim of the game is to say, have we covered all the bases? What have we forgotten? Are there things we still need to do? And I hope that we haven't forgotten too many, but we'll soon find out. I want to turn now to use as an example an illustration of what I think governments need to do, and this government, federal government, has done it, because we have a rationed resource here. Our support for research is rationed. It's been rationed as long as I can remember. I can remember as a much younger academic, still active in science, coming here for National Health and Medical Research Council, interviewing committees, into Perth, staying in some hotel, drinking too much sake on one night with the research fellows of the NHMRC and too much of something else with other people. But what we had to do was to identify and vote out of 6 whether a grant that we had just, or the investigator which we had just interviewed, whether that individual's grant was worth funding. We had to vote on it out of 6, take the average score, and then we'd sit down there and worry, what's the cut-off score going to be this year? 5.2, 5.3? This was really worth funding, wasn't it? Should we make it 5.3 rather than 5.22? Whatever it happened to be. It's always been rationed. So how do you handle that? Do you spread it ever more thinly? One solution is just to put a truckload more money into it. Do not delude yourselves into believing that any government in Australia in the present or in the future will actually just put a tip truck into the granting councils and add more money so that people making decisions don't have to go through those sorts of choices. They won't do that. We can make a case for more money. We can certainly try to do that. But it's never going to stop the fact that it will always be less than we could spend. And simply to say that we could spend more if we had more is not a case for more. And that's the case that we've used for as long as I can remember. So we took the view that many other countries have taken, and that is that when you have a resource that's rationed and you have the processes that we have, with peer review systems and all the rest built into it, which I support, but built into it, then there is always a risk that you will not do all the things you need to do in the interests of the country, the interests of the people of the country. So you have to prioritise. It is about prioritising. And America's had priorities for decades. The UK's had priorities for a long time. The EU has priorities. Many of the countries of Europe have priorities. China has priorities. India has priorities. Vietnam has priorities. There are priorities for expenditure all over the place, especially in this area, because it will always be less than you could possibly spend. So we've set up our priorities. Those of you who are interested in this will have found them already, and I'm going to try and forestall some of the questions that you might be ready to ask me. So some people say that priorities shut down basic research. Simply not true. Not true. You could frame them to exclude basic research, but neither we, nor the Americans, nor the British, nor the European Union have done that. And we've not done that for all the reasons that the advocates for basic research put forward. It's important, of course. It's integral, of course. It must be supported to find the breakthrough solutions to so many of the challenges we face and that we can't predict yet, of course. So the priorities cover the spectrum from basic to applied science, as they do in other countries, and as they should. Some people, other people, not always the same people, say that you can't, quote, pick winners. If ever you want to see me turn green and look ill, then just tell me that this is all about picking winners. I have never heard such an antediluvian, idiotic approach to a serious issue in my life, and it is not unique to, but it is still used more commonly in Australia than it's used in most of those other countries I've referred to. And it irritates me, so I'll put that to one side, but I'm still going to talk about it. You have to pick something for the reasons that I just described. You have a resource that's limited. You have to ration it. How do you allocate a rationed resource? You don't just smear it like Vegemite over a sliced loaf. You actually try to say, we've got to do it this way and we've got to do it that way, and you've got to be careful in your choices. So I think you have to pick something. And there are, of course, and the reason for that is that there are any number of opinions about how they should be spent. Well, if you wanted to put that the other way around, you'd say that when your resource is rationed, do you just continue to spread it thinly? You can make your choices in the absence of a shared framework, and so can anyone who ever has to make choices, from researchers to vice-chancellors to industries to ministers. And the sum total of all that will be haphazard success, a great deal of overlap and the likelihood of serious gaps. Or you can make informed choices based on input from experts, scientists and researchers, leaders from business and industry, health professionals and community leaders. You can then give other people the information to make their own choices with a view to doing something greater than themselves. Now, I've never suggested, and nobody has ever suggested, and the government certainly hasn't suggested, that all our research expenditure should be allocated to the priority areas. Simply that an appropriate proportion that will give us confidence that we are prepared in all the areas we need to be. One of the things that's put to me is that since the research path is by definition unknowable, if you can't predict the outcomes, you shouldn't try to plan the inputs. But I don't accept that the uncertainty of the journey makes it impossible to point to a destination. So let me use the United States to illustrate. During the last 2 years, the US FDA has approved 19 new cancer drugs for the market and for clinical use over the last 2 years. They exist today because of federally funded research that was begun in 1971 under the rubric of the war on cancer. And certainly some of you, and some of you my age, there's nobody here my age, but anybody just within 5 years of my age, would actually remember Richard Nixon, before his demise, speaking boldly and plainly about how they were going to declare war on cancer. And 30 years later, 19 new drugs go on the market arising from that research, because that mission-directed research focused on basic research all the way through to material that could be used in the clinic to help people suffering from that particular suite of disease. In the last 7 years, there are 700 million iPhones sold around the world. The internet, GPS, touchscreen display and the voice-activated personal assistant called Siri all have their origins in mission funded through DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency. All of them. Basic research, all through to the application. And somebody had the bright idea, had the mind, and had the supporting environment to say, look at all these things. If we put all of them together, we could build a thing we'll call an iPhone. And they did. When the same company decided that it would build an iPad, they were told that they were stupid because they were told that there was no market for an iPad. They went ahead and did it, and as soon as the queues kilometres long formed outside the Apple stores around the world, all the other makers produced tablets. If Apple had let the economists rule their product and their future, we might have them now, but there would have been a big delay between somebody with the spark and the spirit to take all of this material and put it together and make something like that. And I'll bet you a fair proportion of this audience has got an iPad as well, of course, as a smartphone or a tablet, not just an iPad. So I think these are examples of mission-led research, and we could go on for a long time about them, but delivering on their goals along paths that only proved more fruitful than their proponents had expected. So in terms of the Australian priorities, which I hope will turn out with some things like that, there is nothing startling in the 9 priorities for Australia. If I tell you that the priority areas of food, soil and water, resources, energy, transport, cyber security, advanced manufacturing, health and environmental change are important, I don't know how many of you could disagree with those. But the thing is that we've articulated them. The second thing is that we're now sending out a letter to the departments and agencies of the Commonwealth saying that a proportion of their research and development expenditure has got to be focused on those priority areas, alongside all the ones they do for themselves. These priorities are not exhaustive and they're not exclusive. They're simply saying these are important things for us to make sure that we're working on right now, because we have a national need. We have a national imperative. We have an aspiration. How many times have you heard that Australia will be the food bowl of Asia? How many have rolled your eyes when you think of that impossible aspiration? But at the same time, if we're going to be a serious contributor to providing nourishing food to the rest of the world, then we can't just do what we've always done. And we've got to focus attention, we've got to make sure we spend the right amount in the right way at the right time, and still, alongside all that, provide the support that the basic researchers need for the ideas, for the intelligence, for the knowledge that we need to be able to underpin some of that work. So the departments and agencies of the Commonwealth will be having to acquit to the government in the future about how much of their expenditure for R&D they spend in those priority areas. And I think that the government has also, by announcing them, has demonstrated to business and universities that we have a shared commitment to tackle them. And so I suggest to you that this is a great leap forward for us. It's a great leap forward for the research sector as well as for the country. So let me conclude with a few pep talks. Imagine that we're really all anxious to do something. So let me just say that science is what we must do. It'll be good science. It's got to be good science. It'll be science that lets us control some part of our future and build the sort of future we want, rather than one that just happens to float past that we can grab, if we can grab it. Of course, we're going to draw much into our country from elsewhere. Of course we will. The most optimistic assessments are we're about a 3% player in the world of research. But that doesn't mean to say we can just go and buy it off a shelf in New York. It means that we've actually got to have the talent and skills to be able to use it if we go and get it and bring it in. So there's a whole ecosystem, a whole infrastructure that we need to be able to secure that future that we would plan for ourselves and build for ourselves, because we have to look after ourselves. But we've got to be a good global citizen. It's not just about island Australia, fortress Australia, Australia separated from the rest of the world. It's about how Australia links with the rest of the world. It's about how we do things with the rest of the world and citizens from elsewhere who've got the same hopes and aspirations as we have, and the same doubts and problems that we have in many, many cases. But to be good at what we do, to be good as a research nation, as a science nation, we have to it requires all of us to look after that so-called ecosystem. It requires all of us to see that the priority for us has got to be that ecosystem. And we've got to remember that it's built from its components, that ecosystem. It's not just about education. It's not only about research. It's not only about international engagement. It's not only about education and training. It is actually about all of them working together coherently, properly, to build the ecosystem so that we will prosper and we can share that prosperity with others in other countries as we learn from them and we give to them. So we're all in it together, ladies and gentlemen. So let's work together and just get better. Thank you.